I bought and have been working on a 2-litre CU Type 4 engine now for the last week or so. I bought it rather hastily to put in my van because the 1600 CT engine's got end float and it's on its last, without a full rebuild at least. However, when I bought this, I didn't check to see if it would actually fit, and it's not quite as straightforward as I was at least hoping it would be. So I thought quickly we'd run through basically what the issues are and some of the solutions to fitting a 2-litre CU into both a CT gearbox, but also into a Beetle gearbox as well, into a bug box, because it's basically the same issue. So the problems come when you come to connect your engine to your gearbox. Now this gearbox is actually a Beetle gearbox, but say I'm just using it for demonstration purposes, but it's exactly the same as the CT, so I'll show you why in a second. So in the centre of here is your input shaft, and obviously that goes into the hole in the centre of your flywheel there. And if we measure from the face of the bell house, you can see that the input shaft sticks out by approximately 15mm from that face. Unfortunately, that means it's not long enough to go all the way in there and reach the pilot bearing. So the pilot bearing in there basically supports the end of the input shaft, and it stops it from wiggling around like that, which I'm pretty sure is a surefire way of destroying the gearbox. Yeah, at least it's not something I want to leave and find out. And because the 1600 CT engine is loosely based on a Beetle engine, you run into the same problems on a CT gearbox. So again, from the face of the bell house, the input shaft on this sticks out by approximately 15mm, which I say isn't long enough to get to the pilot bearing to be supported. So what you're going to do? I guess the first thing you could do is replace the gearbox. So you could get the correct air-cooled gearbox that goes with the 2-litre CU engines, and they should fit in relatively easily. However, you will need to chop off the front gearbox mount and move it forward slightly, and you will also have to change the front linkage, I believe, because they are slightly different. The box is slightly longer. So it's not straightforward, but then you would have the correct gearbox and engine combination. But that's not what I want to do. Basically, I don't have the money and the funds to be buying new gearboxes as well as the engine I've got. Certainly not the 6-rev gearboxes now, because they're just going for crazy money, because all the drag racers have stolen them all. So what I want to do is basically make the 2-litre CU work with the gearbox I've already got. Now, before anybody writes on the comments and says, "Oh, your final drives won't be right," I know, and to be honest with you, I don't really care. So I've kind of lived with a 1776 on a 1200 gearbox for years, and I'm happy to have the final drive not being quite right. I'll just take it nice and easy. So it's more about getting me up and running quick and easy and cheaply as it is to be correct, if that makes sense. So yeah, the other issue is the starter motor on here. I don't know if that will work with the Type 4 flywheel. Again, we'll find out in a bit when I give it a try and all the engine's back in place. So how are we going to support this? I'll show you. I have heard of people relocating the pilot bearing forwards into the flywheel. I haven't looked into that, and I don't know if it involves machine work or not, because that's not my plan. So what I'm planning to do basically is replace it with a bronze bush like this one. Now this particular one came from stateside tuning here in the UK. It was about 15 quid delivered to the door. And basically what you do is you have to remove all the bolts anyway, and the little washer. Behind there is a little retaining seal or ring or washer. Behind that is a felt washer that needs to come out, and then the pilot bearing behind that comes out. So when we take them all out, and then it gets replaced by that. And in theory, it supports the end of the input shaft and stops it from moving around. However, before you do that, you need to make sure you get the right one. So the centre hole in the centre of the flywheel there, apparently there's 2 different sizes and the Type 4 engines. This particular one was a 19mm outside diameter, but to measure that you'd have to remove all the nuts, the metal washer and the metal seal as well, so you can get an accurate measurement to check before you order the right one. Right, let's get on with it. So that previously was in there, I've already removed that. It basically retains the felt washer that's behind it. Stops the oil coming forwards. This pilot bearing put up a right fight. It's a nightmare. Let's see if we can get this bushing. Well, that fits perfectly in the centre of the flywheel. It doesn't stick out at all. Bronze bush is fitted in the flywheel there. Flywheel's back on, and we've torqued up the flywheel nuts to 81 foot-pounds, which is what you need for the 2 litre CU. Now, the bronze bush itself turned out to be the same depth as the flywheel, face to face. So all the time I took removing the pilot bearing was completely pointless. Also because I didn't measure the outer diameter of the pilot bearing. It turns out the recess in the crank is actually larger than the centre of the flywheel anyway. So even if it did go past, as I was told it should do, it would have been rattle fit. So what I'm basically saying is double check your measurements before you start pulling pilot bearings out. You don't need to, because in my case I could have left it in there and it would have caused no issue at all that I can see. Because I made such a hash actually fitting the bronze bush into the flywheel, I had to spend a little while with some fine grain emery paper and some wire wool, because I think I slightly nipped the bush and it deformed the edges slightly as I put it in. So before I actually bolted all this on, I did make sure that it fitted perfectly on the end of the input shaft. You also notice I've cleaned up the end of the input shafts just to make sure there's no oxide on there or old oil that will stop the bush from sliding on nicely. And so before I actually bolted it on, I did check on the van to make sure that the flywheel would go on nicely. Because the last thing you want to do is have it all bolted back onto the engine and try and fit it into the gearbox and not know that it's not going into the bush properly, or even worse, pushing the bush out. So the engine's in. It went in relatively easily, even though I did it the hard way, like a beetle, so I didn't take the gearbox out. Now the engine went in quite well. I made sure I got a nice and straight and level before I tried pushing them together. And I did cheat. I put a very small amount of grease on the input shaft to make sure it slid through the new bronze bush without any dragging or catching. So it seemed to go together very easily. However, I have been fighting now for a couple of hours, possibly longer, with the engine mount bars. Now, I assumed when I fitted the CU that the engine bar would be in its correct position, and it doesn't appear to be. So basically, when you looked at the engine bar, there's an arrow on top, and the arrow is facing backwards, which means the engine bar effectively was in the same position as the CT one, so in its furthest forward position. Now, the only way to change that and basically bring the engine bar back slightly is to either take the engine bar off, which means taking exchanges and exhausts and stuff off, or re-drill it. So I re-drilled mine. So some actually shown to have 4 holes in, but both this one and the one from the CT only has 2 for some reason. So effectively I've just re-drilled it as it would be if it's flipped around, which brings the engine bar further back on the chassis rail, and it's taking all that stress out of the joints and the rubbers and stuff. And also, if you look at the engine, it does appear to be slightly to the left hand side of the van. So we're slightly closer here, we're a finger width here, and we've got an extra 5mm gap there. So we are slightly off centre. Now, I don't think that'll be an issue in terms of the gearbox and the CVs. I don't think the linkage will make any qualms about it because it's that sloppy. So again, we'll just run it for now, see how it goes, and if I have any trouble, we'll look at remounting the engine bar. So what I did do is actually elongated the holes very slightly so I could bring the engine bar about 5mm to this side of the van, which just helped a fraction. Let's say it's still slightly out, but not enough to worrying me at the minute. So we're going to continue, and it may be something that I revisit in the future. But just remember, if you're going from CT to CU, your engine bar will be in the forward position as a CT, and it goes to the furthest back position for the CU. The new CU came with a 009 distributor, so as such this little rat's nest is now redundant, so we don't need that anymore. So basically I've unscrewed it, and we'll just keep it for a rainy day. I don't know if this is the same as the one for CU or how it works, because I don't have the original distributor for the CU, so it just has to go for now. Okay, so I'm going to try and start it. I say the starter motor is what was on the CT. I've not changed anything there, so fingers crossed. We're in neutral. Clutch is a little bit heavier, I think. As I say, I've not really used it. It feels a little bit heavy, but it's not unusable at all. Fingers crossed. Hope there's no crunchy noises. Hey! So the CT started absolutely fine. So in conclusion, the engine swap went quite easily, and there was less problems than I expected. Obviously we've got the bush in the flywheel, and you have to swap the engine bar mount at the back to its longest position, so the furthest back position. But they're the kind of the big ones really. There was a slight issue with the accelerator cable. So originally it came through on this side, but because this engine's been fitted with the Weber 32-36 carb, it has to come through on the other side, and the linkage had to be extended a little bit, so I made a threaded extension, but it's working fine. I'm assuming if you have the original carb that comes with the CU and the CT, the cable's probably okay, but it's something to look out for. I've already shown you the electric pack's gone, because I've got the 009 on the coil, and the Weber works well in low vacuum, so we don't need the vac advance on there. Starter wise, this is the starter which I've got problems with, but not down to the conversion, so basically it was missing the bush, it was moving around a bit. So this is the starter that came with the CT engine, and it started that fine, and it's also been starting the CU engine fine. I've done a couple hundred miles with it, there doesn't seem to be any issues at all. If you compare it with a late bay one, again there's very little difference. So in terms of compatibility, the same starter motor should work for either engine, as far as I can tell. I'm just checking the plugs and stuff now, but overall I'm really happy with it. So on the motorway it'll sit at 60 quite happily, and it's not overly noisy at that speed. So in terms of CU to CT gearbox ratios, it's not an issue, I don't think. It quite happily gets up to that speed. So it's no Ferrari, but it's not slow either. So I'm quite happy with it. It will go faster, I just haven't pushed it because it's a new engine to me effectively, and I'm in no rush, trying to keep the fuel economy sensible. So yeah, overall very, very happy with what's happened. That is because as you may have seen in an earlier video, the tow bar doesn't fit with manual exhaust. So again, you may have to consider that, but I'll just be remaking a new tow bar for it, and I'll put that back in place as soon as I can. Yeah, pretty chuffed. Cheers guys, hope it helps.